They are coming, and there is nowhere to take the wounded. It is just after dawn on the 7th of July, 1944, on the island of Saipan, and the largest enemy charge of the entire Pacific War has just broken over the American lines. Thousands of men are pouring down through the smoke toward the rear, screaming, overrunning everything in their path, and directly in that path stands a tent, a front-line aided station, packed with dozens of American wounded, men with shattered legs and bandaged chests who cannot walk, cannot run, cannot lift a weapon to save themselves. There is one officer in that tent who is not wounded. He has not been trained to hold a line. His job, his entire reason for being in the army, is to save lives, not to take them. And in the next few minutes he is going to do something that his profession, his training, and the rules of war all say he should never do. If true, forgotten stories of the men who fought this war are what you came for, take a second and subscribe. Now, back to that tent on Saipan, and to the officer standing between the wounded and the wave. To understand what he did, you have to understand what he was, because he was the last man on that island you would have expected to be found behind a machine gun. He had not come to Saipan to fight. He had come to fix people. Everything about his training was about mending the human body, gently, carefully in a chair, with small, precise instruments. He was, by trade and by temperament, a healer. And the choice he made in that tent, the choice to pick up a weapon and become the thing that stood between an enemy army and his helpless patients, was the exact opposite of everything he had spent his life learning to do. His name was Ben Salomon. He was a captain in the United States Army, and he was a dentist. Everything you're about to hear is documented in the Army's own records of Saipan, in the accounts of the men he saved. Captain Ben Salomon, Dental Corps, a man whose war, until that morning, had been spent pulling teeth and repairing jaws, was about to fight and die like no dentist in history ever has. The man white not desiosid. The man was real. What he did was real. And the reason it took his country 58 years to honor it is its own quiet scandal. Ben Salomon was a dentist from Wisconsin, a well-liked, easy-going man with a thriving practice. When the Army drafted him in 1940, they put him where a dentist goes, in the Dental Corps, and for years that is what he did. The ordinary, unglamorous work of keeping soldiers' mouths healthy, a captain with a drill and a chair, as far from the front line as a man in uniform can be. He was good at it, and popular, and by every account kind. There was nothing about him that marked him as a warrior. He was the doctor you were glad to see, the gentle one, the man whose hands were trained to be careful. But Salomon had another quality that the tooth-pulling never showed, which was that he could not stand to be in the safe place while other men were in the dangerous one. When the infantry regiment he was attached to lost its frontline surgeon to wounds, Ben Salomon volunteered to take the job, to leave the relative safety of the dental station and move up to the aid station right behind the fighting line, where the wounded came in fastest and the danger was real. He did not have to. A dentist was not required to volunteer as a combat surgeon. He put his hand up anyway. And so, on Saipan in July of 1944, the gentle dentist from Wisconsin was running an aid station at the very front of one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. And there was one more thing about Ben Salomon that almost no one knew, and that turns the impossible into something merely astonishing. Before he was ever a dentist in uniform, when Army first drafted him in 1940, they had made him an ordinary infantryman, and he had been a superb one. He had trained with the rifle and the pistol and the machine gun, and he had been so good at it that his regiment named him its best all-around soldier, an expert who knew weapons as well as any line trooper in the Army. Only later, when the Army realized it had a trained dentist carrying a rifle, did it move him to the Dental Corps to use his real profession. So the man behind that machine gun on Saipan was not a helpless doctor who got lucky. He was a superb infantryman who had spent 2 years pulling teeth, and when the moment came, both of those men were standing in that tent. Saipan was a catastrophe for the Japanese defenders, and by the 7th of July their situation was hopeless, and so their commanders ordered the thing that hopeless armies in that war ordered: a final all-out Banzai charge, a massed suicidal attack meant to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. It was the largest such charge of the entire Pacific War. Thousands of men and stragglers, everyone who could still hold a weapon, and sailors still hold a weapon, formed up in the dark and threw themselves at the American line at first light, in a human wave that simply overwhelmed the forward positions by sheer weight of numbers. The wave broke through, and it came fast, and it came toward the rear, toward the aid stations and the artillery and the wounded. In Salomon's tent there were, by the accounts, around 30 wounded men, some of them unable to move at all. He could hear it coming. He knew what a Banzai charge did to everything in its path, and he understood, with terrible clarity, that in a very few minutes the enemy would be inside that tent, and that his 30 helpless patients had no chance at all unless someone bought them the time to be carried out. There was exactly one person available to buy that time, him, so he gave the order. He told the walking wounded to pick up the men who could not walk and get them out, back toward the second line, right now, and he told them he would hold the enemy at the tent while they went. It was, for a doctor, an almost unthinkable inversion of everything he was. His job was to be the last calm place, the safe hands, the man who did not fight. Instead, he positioned himself between his patients and the door, and when the first enemy soldiers cut through the tent wall, Ben Salomon met them himself and began, alone, to hold the line, so that the wounded behind him could be dragged to safety. What happened next is reconstructed from the physical evidence the way you would reconstruct any last stand, from where the bodies lay and where the weapons were found, because the man at the center of it did not survive to tell it. But he fought first with what was at hand as the enemy forced their way in. When he got outside and found a machine gun whose entire crew had been killed, he took it over himself, a dentist behind a heavy machine gun, and he began to fire into the oncoming mass to hold the ground in front of the tent. And as the position was flanked and nearly overrun again and again, he did not fall back to safety. He picked up the gun and moved it forward, 4 separate times by the evidence, each time to a spot where he could keep the enemy off his wounded a little longer, each time deeper into the danger, not out of it. He held, for long enough. Behind him, the walking wounded carried and dragged their helpless comrades on back to the next line, one man at a time buying every yard of that retreat, with the time Ben Salomon was purchasing at the machine gun. The 30 men in his aid station, the men who could not have saved themselves, got out because the gentle dentist stood in the door and would not move except forward. And somewhere in there, still firing, still holding, Captain Ben Salomon was killed. When the American lines were restored and the counterattack pushed back over the ground that had been lost, they came to the aid station, and they found him. Ben Salomon was slumped over the machine gun, dead, his hand still on it. And in front of his position, in a rough arc where his fire had swept, lay the bodies of 98 enemy soldiers. 98. A dentist, alone, with a machine gun he had never been trained to use, had killed 98 men to keep them off 30 wounded Americans, and had moved the gun forward 4 times to do it, and had died at his post with the wounded safely gone. Sighed. When they examined his body, they counted the wounds. There were 76 of them, and the 76 of them concluded that many of those wounds had been suffered while he was still alive and still fighting, that he had been hit again, and had kept firing anyway, kept buying time long past the point where most men's bodies would have simply stopped. The gentleman from the dental chair, the last person on the island anyone would have picked for a last stand, had made one of the most ferocious and selfless last stands of the entire war. And he had made it not to take ground or win glory, but for the oldest reason a doctor has, to keep his patients alive. His commanding officer, stunned by what he found, wanted Ben Salomon to receive the Medal of Honor immediately, and here the story recommendation was refused, and the reason it was refused was a technicality about who Salomon was. He was a medical officer, and the rules governing medical personnel in war, meant to protect doctors as non-combatants, were read to mean that a medical officer could not be decorated for combat, that in taking up arms he had done something the army could not officially praise. Never mind that he had taken up those arms only to defend wounded men who could not defend themselves, which the laws of war expressly permit. The paperwork was returned. The Medal of Honor was not awarded, and so it sat, for decades. The men who had been there knew what he had done. The evidence was overwhelming: the 98 dead, the 4 positions, the 76 wounds, the 30 patients who lived. The division's own historian had walked that ground within days, counted the bodies himself, traced the 4 machine gun positions Salomon had fought from, and written it all down carefully, precisely because he feared exactly this, that a thing this extraordinary might otherwise be lost or disbelieved. His account survived. So the recommendation kept dying anyway, blocked and lost and delayed, year after year, by the technicality and by simple bureaucratic inertia, while the men who could testify to it grew old and died. It was not until 2002, 58 years after that morning, on Saipan, that the United States finally awarded Captain Ben Salomon the Medal of Honor, long after he could know it, long after most of the men he saved were gone. The record had been right there the whole time, written in the arc of bodies in front of a machine gun and in a historian's careful notes. It just took the country nearly 6 decades to admit what it said. It is tempting to remember Ben Salomon for the 98, because the number is staggering, and it should be. But the number is not really the point of him. The point of him is the direction he faced. Every instinct a doctor is trained to have told him to stay with the wounded, to be the calm hands, to not pick up the gun. And when the wave came, he understood that on that particular morning the only way left to save his patients was to become, for a few minutes, the exact opposite of what he was, to stand in the door and kill and be killed so that 30 helpless men could be carried out behind him. He did not do it because he was a warrior. He did it because he was a healer, and healing those men that morning meant holding that door. That is the whole story, and it is worth holding on to, because Ben Salomon was not a soldier who happened to be a dentist. He was a dentist to his core, a man whose entire life was about mending people. And he brought that, not abandoned it, to the machine gun. The last thing he did on Earth was keep his patients alive, the same thing he had done every ordinary day of his career. Only this time it cost him 76 wounds in his life and 98 of theirs. The country took 58 years to call it what it was. The men he carried off that island did not need 58 years. They knew, walking away alive, exactly what the gentle dentist had done in the door behind them. And they spent the rest of their lives telling anyone who would listen until at last the record caught up to the truth they had carried out of that tent.